Yeah, yeah. Oh, very good. It looks like we've got everybody here, so I think we can go get started. And welcome to Science Sunday, December 7th. And, I probably talked on this topic of hunter-gatherers at least 3 times here over the last couple of years. Does anybody remember my talks? We got one here that's been to them in the past.
Okay, good. New converts to the cause.
New converts. There you go, John. And I'm Jim Walter, and let me introduce my collaborators that are here. Charles Hamacher, who raised his hand, and John McDonald. And we meet every Monday morning in Oak Park at Fairgrounds Cafe and talk about this. So if anybody's interested in in this area and wants to work a little bit on it, there's my email. I've got my card here, my YouTubes I can give you. And we're always interested in people collaborating with us. We're working on a book now with the same title as the talk today. So the thesis today is, in mobile hunter-gatherer bands, before the end of the last ice age, egalitarianism, consisting of 4 behaviors, produced the natural selection for our psychology. To start here, these are kind of 1, 2, 3 on the top there, background issues that we should go through, kind of get started on this topic, is that really the high quality of the artifacts from before the end of the last ice age. You're familiar with the cave art and the blades that they were making. It indicates, and most people agree, that they had all of our psychological abilities that had evolved before the end of the last ice age. But this presented a problem to determine what were the natural selection processes that were going on in these mobile hunter-gatherer bands before the end of the last ice age that had such strong natural selection pressures that we developed these, amazing psychological abilities that we all, have today. And that was a problem because it's so long ago. There are just a few artifacts. There's no way to really study that. But a big breakthrough came when they found representative mobile hunter-gatherer bands living today that represent life before the end of the last ice age. That is, they were making the same artifacts. They'd been living in isolation since the end of the last ice age. So the anthropologists really jumped on this to study these bands in detail to determine what was the natural selection that caused, our psychology. And so to kind of get you into the story, you're familiar with the mobile hunter-gatherer bands. The males are out hunting during the day. Females are gathering food products and taking care of the children. And in the evening, the women cook the evening meal. And a lot of the organization of societies around these evening meals, the men are out all day, they come back, they have to have a meal to eat, and that's a big part of the organization. So on the right, the main source of information for the talk today is Richard Wrangham's book, 2019, The Goodness Paradox. The strange relationship between virtue and violence in human evolution. And so the paradox is this idea of the low level of our anger, aggression, in the sense that, you all are sitting here next to each other, you're not feeling any aggression towards your neighbor, In the rest of nature, closeness is a marker for aggression. And so that's our virtue. He looks at, describe that. And our violence is this high level of planned aggression that apparently evolved in these hunter-gatherer bands. The coalitional aggression, the warfare, this so he calls this good and evil. The good is our low level of anger aggression, and the evil is our high level of planned aggression. And he goes on to talk about conscience and conscience abilities and other aspects of our psychology that we're also evolving at the same time. Now, we've published 4 reviews of this paper, and the 4th one here is a handout that you can read, take with you. And so we've been in kind of active discussion with Dr. Wrangham, and as I say, we're writing a book now with the title of this talk. So here's the main crux of the story. It's the representative mobile hunter-gatherer band studies. And let's see, did I skip one there? No, that's it. Okay. The processes, as we said in the thesis, was that egalitarianism and its 4 behaviors were producing the strong natural selection for our psychology. So these band studies are, pivotal, with the idea that they were high-quality studies, much higher quality than any anthropological work that had ever been done in hunter-gatherer bands before. And they did 10 to 20-year studies, and they really looked at traits, death, and progeny, so that they could, these were the measures you need to have to determine what was the natural selection going on for psychology. And so there's Dr. Wrangham's book. Boehm studied about 20 different bands, and then there are the 4 other anthropologists. So I'm going to have several slides on this, just to run through to get your idea of the 4 behaviors. The egalitarianism and the 4 behaviors. So behavior 1 is egalitarianism, and that's, you're familiar with for the hunter-gatherers, sharing in particular, like if anybody gets an animal kill, they come back, they share it with everybody in the band. Then number 2 is norm breakers, those that are kind of going against the egalitarian way of life. And then 3A is targeting the norm breakers with these coalitional activities. That is, everybody in the band agrees on this targeting of gossip, ostracism, and executions in some cases, which are conducted to reverse the norm breakers, and basically it's effective in getting people to go back to supporting the egalitarian social norms of the mobile hunter-gatherers. So this is the main process, and you kind of saw it with arrows. This is going on all the time in the hunter-gatherers, the strong egalitarianism, and then how they manage it. So 3B, 4A, and 4B. So the anthropologists observed that those individuals that were targeted had shorter lives and fewer progeny. And if you know by your understanding of natural selection, these are the types of measures that you need to say natural selection is going on. And I'll go into that in more detail. Then 4A and 4B is that so everybody in the mobile hunter-gatherer is aware of these, sometimes we call it shorter lives and mortal and reproductive risks. This is the main mortal and reproductive risk in the hunter-gatherer band. And everybody in the band is aware of these risks of being targeted. So they're trying to behave to avoid being targeted and and then avoiding the effects after being targeted, because it would occur, over days or weeks. So that 3A is it's natural selection. Really, psychological traits are what are being selected for. You're really talking about social norms, and then people breaking the social. Those are highly psychological processes, and it's psychological processes that are being selected for. So let's go through it in detail. Here it is. It's really the main idea of the talk that came out of these mobile hunter-gatherer representative studies. So the egalitarianism is sharing. They're friendly, cooperative. They even call it participatory democracy. So they just observed in the hunter-gatherer bands, like whenever they go out hunting, everybody that's hunting gets a say. They see tracks in the ground. Everybody gets a say. Everybody gets their opinion. And likewise, when they're talking in other activities in the band, everybody gets a voice, and they really said it's really a participatory democracy that's going on here. The Married Men's Coalition is the main coalition of the bands, and they're primarily responsible for setting the social norms of the bands, but they're supported by the Women's Coalition too. So there are no property rights. They're migratory. For example, there are no chiefs. Really, in the egalitarian society, nobody is at a state. It's really the coalition that's dominant, and really, when you think about the first and second behavior, those that were breaking the social norms, we'll just go on here. And then, so it's subsistence living. They're highly social. They say, they only use their huts for sleeping at night. They're talking, laughing, singing all day long out as a group. Highly social compared to our modern life today. Animism perfused all the thinking, and animism was in all the bands. They found like it was graded. Nature was on top, men were second, and women were third, and it kind of fit in with the idea of the male coalition, kind of setting the social norms, and they kind of set them to their own advantage. For example, they all exhibited polygamy and other things that women might be against, but the women coalitions went ahead and supported these programs because the men were out hunting all day with all the risks of that, and if they had something like an execution, it was the men that did the execution, and that kept the egalitarianism in there, so that the women kind of supported the social norms that were primarily set by the men. And so when all of these, we're really talking about psychological abilities, just like we have today, but almost even more so, because they say it's such a social group. They're all talking, and kind of this participatory democracy. Everybody has to give their opinion about everything. And then the norm breakers are those that would be selfish, anger, aggression, conflict with the social norms. And the other big one was just kind of arbitrary conflict, that people would, it wasn't clear what they were doing wrong, but it was clear that everybody in the group thought that they were breaking the social norms. So number 3, and that 1, 2, and 3A is kind of the primary thing that's going on in the hunter-gatherer bands. And these other, like 3B and 4A and B, are really kind of secondary that come out of the primary processes above. So 3A was the targeting of the norm breakers, those that were breaking the social norms. And it was described as planned coalitional aggression, with the idea of even saying one of our psychological traits is planned coalitional aggression. Compared to no other animal on Earth has abilities for, complex and such active coalitional types of aggression. For example, they said, really, you need language to have coalitional aggression. In a coalition, you have to have agreement with everybody in the coalition that we're going to do this or we're going to do that. And it's the only way you would get able to understand these complex activities if they're language. And you're sure that everybody is in agreement and they're going to go along with it. Only with kind of extensive psychological abilities can you have coalitional aggression. So the first one is gossip and then ostracism. And, generally gossip and ostracism would get people to stop their adverse behaviors and get them back, kind of on the egalitarian norms. And there was great risk for gossiping and ostracism. In particular, ostracism, you wouldn't be admitted for the evening meal. Well, you're looking at starvation within a couple of days if you don't get the evening meal. So that it has a very powerful effect on people to change their behavior and be part of the egalitarian system. And of course, a few executions, and the executions in particular, you kind of define them, and Wrangham talks a lot about it in his book. He said, these are mobile hunter-gatherer bands with 30 to 40 individuals, and even, say, killing one individual that had high aggression would reduce the gene pool for aggression in the band. And he was arguing that these executions were occurring at the rate of like one every 3 or 4 years. And that rate alone was enough to produce the low level of anger aggression that we all exhibit today. So the targeted had shorter lives and fewer progenies, as particularly shown with executions. And so this was strong natural selection for our psychological abilities, and it is argued it's really the natural selection source of all of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors today. And then everybody's aware of the adverse effects of being targeted, the mortal and reproductive dangers, and they try to avoid that. After being targeted, the target, like the ostracism would occur over days or weeks, and the people would try to change their behavior so they stop being ostracized. So again, you really are talking about psychological abilities, and this adds to the natural selection pressure, so really resulting in strong natural selection pressures for basically all of our psychological abilities. This is the main argument of the talk today. And look at the timeline for the egalitarianism and four behaviors. You see at the top, the timeline, we have egalitarianism. It's a proto-developing. And at 135,000 years ago, there's an important paper out that's showing our language abilities evolved by then. And I'll say more about that. But that's become a really important time point in defining these natural selection processes. That one is your language abilities. It's been identified to have occurred at 135,000 South Africa, published in Frontiers of Psychology. And, it's very important for egalitarianism. You can't have egalitarianism without language. So language is kind of the trigger for all of the natural selection for psychology that's going on here. At 75,000 years ago, you have the first symbolic and conceptual art that, that we associate with language abilities. At 65 and 50,000, you have funerary practices, artwork, complex behaviors. And also at 60 and 50,000, you have the migrations out of Africa. And so that all people today, everybody in this room is highly related because of those migrations out of Africa, 50 to 60,000. And we all have essentially the same language abilities. So 12,000 years ago is the end of the last ice age. And it's really these high-quality artifacts. I'm sure you've seen the art from Chauvet in France, that, just beautiful art. And the arrowheads that are so beautiful. So that it's kind of the idea that all of our psychological abilities had evolved before the end of the last ice age. And then spend a little time here on egalitarianism not being active after the end of the last ice age, that is today. So we're saying that this strong egalitarianism, natural selection pressure was primarily occurring between 135 and 12,000 years ago. And after the end of the last ice age, with the introduction of farming and then, recently our modern ages, we've moved on from egalitarianism to, hierarchical societies. And in hierarchical societies, they generally agreement that there's no net natural selection pressure for any particular trait in any particular direction, meaning that our psychology is unchanged since the end of the last ice age. Okay, then, this kind of summarizes the findings that we've been talking about so far, that the natural selection for our psychology came from egalitarianism and the four behaviors. And our psychological abilities, basically, I've listed 9 here. Basically, I'm trying to list all of our psychological abilities. And with that idea in mind, kind of break it down a little bit. Now, the first 3 in red are the 3 that Wrangham talked about, and he argues so well how this egalitarianism caused the evolution of these abilities in us today. And it's a little complicated. So the planned coalitional aggression is another word for egalitarianism. And it's one of the 4 behaviors. But, the coalitional aggression is this gossip, ostracism, and in some cases execution that's kind of driving the natural selection before the end of the last ice age. And, as we've been talking, that's the direct cause of our low level of anger, reactive aggression. That we're quite comfortable sitting here with each other without any feelings of aggression whatsoever. And it's the origin of our conscience. That is, the mortal and reproductive risks in the hunter-gatherer band due to this egalitarianism was so great that to avoid those risks, those moral and reproductive risks, a conscience was needed to be able to consider and, decide and conduct your behavior such that you would not be at risk of breaking the egalitarian norms. Then the last 6 also kind of come out of this idea that with these high levels of risk in the mobile hunter branch, you needed all of these psychological abilities to reduce that risk, so that you had really natural selection pressure for learning, cognition, language, personality. Our high level of social awareness of when we're talking to people, we're very much aware of what they're thinking or what they might be thinking if we behave in different ways. And finish up with aesthetics and free will was kind of the most complicated of our psychological abilities. And, why we love music so much and art. And free will in particular, he argues, and we really support his argument, that really you had to have free will and abilities to decide and make moral decisions, to avoid the mortal and reproductive risks in the hunter-gatherer band, which was the strong natural selection for us to have free will and experience life, that we feel like we have free will when we're experiencing life. It's a direct result of this natural selection pressure. So the ratings here, you see I had a 5-point rating scale from very low to very high. And so we're saying the planned coalitional aggression is very high at the end of the last ice age, whereas our anger or reactive aggression is very low. And then all the other abilities are all rated very high. Yeah, just to finish up this first part, that's the main argument of today. And here are the critiques and alternatives that you actually may be more familiar with than the arguments being presented today. I was only presenting the results from 5 mobile hunter-gatherer bands, and the critique is, there's hundreds of mobile bands. Most of them are sedentary, and the sedentary don't really fit into this model in the sense that sedentary already were getting hierarchical values, just like in farming age, and probably reduced natural selection pressures. And but Wrangham really argues that really virtually everybody living before the end of the last ice age was living in these mobile hunter-gatherer bands where the natural selection for our psychology occurred. Like Boehm, he studied 10 different bands. He said he could walk into one of these bands and within 2 days he could determine all the natural selection pressures that were going on, because they were just the same as the prior mobile hunter-gatherer bands that he was in. And, that's strong support for the idea that this is kind of universal behavior before the end of the last ice age. And it's really kind of only universal behavior that you're able to get a natural selection pressure in any one particular direction and produce these effects. So Wrangham rejects this argument, but he thinks there's sufficient data. And that's also part of the stationary bands. We're hierarchical and do not really seem to contradict the results here. There's a concern about the egalitarian selection pressures. I mean, you're probably sitting there kind of skeptical that this could have caused all of my psychological abilities. But actually, in the book, we're doing a pretty extensive comparison to other mammals, and we're getting natural selection pressures defined by the amount of change per million years. So in the case of the giraffe's neck or the elephant's trunk, you're talking about natural selection pressures of 0.1 or 0.2 fold change per million years. Whereas we're calculating natural selection pressures for changes in our psychological abilities well over 100, as much as 500 times greater than that for our psychological evolution, which I think is strong evidence for the only thing that's important in our psychological evolution is this natural selection that was occurring in the mobile hunter, the egalitarianism. There are concerns, political, natural selection, and eugenics are, kind of questions that are always brought in and concerns that are always brought into and it has to do a lot of times with political points of view. And Wrangham argues that these concerns could be managed. I might mention a name problem for egalitarianism and the 4 behaviors. If you notice in the 4 behaviors, only the first behavior seems to be connected with egalitarianism. The other 3 behaviors are all coercion, and bad behavior, the second one. But it's the idea that these 4 in the mobile hunter-gatherer band work together, that they can't exist alone. And it's this characterization of, See, it's kind of the universal, these mobile hunter-gatherer bands, subsistence living, they universally go to the egalitarian organization of their communities, of their society. And that's kind of the underlying argument there. So that I think the egalitarianism and the four behaviors in parentheses by its side kind of manages this thing that only one of the four behaviors really is egalitarianism, right? The other three are more associated with coercion. Now, in the literature too, war, famine, and disease are always big issues, and they're particularly big issues in the hunter-gatherer band. And just generally, Wrangham argues very well that they really did not see any natural selection pressures for psychological abilities for these three issues. That is that, in natural selection, it's a differential survival of a trait that's observed in the population. And the things that were going on with war, disease, and famine did not appear to have selection pressures for psychological traits. So Wrangham dismisses the first six. And so alternative views, basically in the field of psychology and also anthropology, you'll see this argument that each psychological trait has its own selection process. Like we have, fantastic personality traits. Not only a wide variety of personality traits, but a wide variety of levels. And that those aspects of personality are really not supported just by saying that they were coming from that they had direct survival value. So Wrangham argues that no, all our personality traits don't just have survival value. They only have survival value through egalitarianism and the four behaviors. And that it's only with the egalitarianism that you get this extremely strong natural selection pressure that gets, our nature of having these multiple level and multiple varieties of personality. And that argument goes on for the other aspects of our psychology. So let's see, how are we doing for time? Yeah, we're doing pretty good. We still have about 20. I can finish up and we'll have time for discussion. And so I'm going to go much quicker through the last two parts. That's the main argument today. But so part two of egalitarianism, four behaviors, is supporting evidence from our ancestors. So chimpanzees, hominids, and early Homo sapiens. And at 3 time points of 7 million years, 135 years, and we say the end of the last ice age and today. So at 7 million years ago, we had a common ancestor with the chimpanzee, and it's really important to consider these from the point of view of the chimpanzee, of the common ancestor. And in particular, the idea is that there's general agreement that the common ancestor at 7 million years ago is very similar to today's chimpanzee. Now, in the 7 million years, chimpanzees continue to live in the tropical forests, the same tropical forests, and there's really no indication that they've had much trait change in that 7 million years. So when we compare ourselves to the chimpanzee, we can say all the differences that we have occurred in our evolutionary line. That's a very helpful perspective. So let's. So today's chimpanzee represents the common ancestor. The chimpanzee is in the rainforest. It's a large primate, and it's large because it eats the large fruits in the large trees in the tropical forests. 2 is a very important comparison. Wrangham did a comparison of the number of times hitting. You're familiar with the chimpanzees hitting each other a lot. And so we compared our societies to the chimpanzee troops and found that the chimpanzees were hitting themselves 500 times more than we which is, yeah. And the argument for the chimpanzee is the alpha male is the one that does a lot of the hitting, and will do most all of the mating. So it's parental investment perspective that explains this 500 times greater. And the high aggression is also seen in the high sexual dimorphism in the chimpanzee, the male versus the female. The male is so much bigger. So the troop is highly stereotyped behavior. There's very little limited learning and culture going on in the chimpanzee troops. And really their behaviors are most well described with complex reflex behaviors with triggers. For example, the early sun is a trigger for them to get up and start foraging, which they do all day long. You know, the very routine, stereotype, regimented foraging that they do all day long. And another trigger is closeness for fighting. Just sitting here close like this is a trigger for fighting. A chimpanzee sitting this close to each other would not be thinking of anything except fighting. With the idea that, you know, what happened in our evolution, that we changed from this extreme fighting psychology to our, you know, egalitarian, you know, acceptance of one another today. Okay, so we think about the evolution by natural selection. In the chimpanzee, it's the standard predator-prey reproduction selection. And we say in the common ancestor, which is represented by today's chimpanzee, egalitarianism and the four behaviors is not present. So put in our little summary table here on the right is what we had in the prior description of our psychological traits today and at the end of the last ice age. And in contrast, planned coalitional aggression, you know, without language and so forth, it's very low in the chimpanzee. The anger aggression is very high. This is the 500 times higher than we have today. And conscience is very low, very high in us. And, you know, these kind of follow the same pattern. That all of these other abilities are very low in the chimpanzee and very high in us. Okay, now let's move from 7 million years ago to 135,000 years ago, comparing the Homo sapiens at 135,000 years ago compared to us. And why we're using this 135,000 years is really a paper that came out this year. Linguistic capacity was present in the Homo sapien population 135,000 years. Frontiers in psychology. And this is really an important finding, an important perspective of trying to say, because language is so important for the egalitarianism in anything to occur. And this argument that they pinpointed when language was available is very important for this whole argument. And so I beg to disagree a little bit with their findings, but so let's go through the hominids from 7 million years ago up to 135 and the development of language. So we think about our hominin ancestors in Africa, the cooling and drying. They moved into the wooded savanna and wider habitats. To survive in those habitats, they developed the opposable thumb and upright walking, increased in body size times 2. In particular, eating tubers and cooked food and meat by as early as 1.7 million years ago. Brain size increased by 3. 5, increased stone tools, butchering and cooking. So these are very cooperative type of processes. So really the anger aggression is already greatly decreased by this time to be able to do all of these cooperative behaviors. So there's reduced anger aggression. Domestication syndrome is the big C. The chimpanzee, the female is 1/3 the size of the male, whereas in our population today. Females are 80% the size of males. Females are 80% size, and this is increased female size. And it's typical of the domestication syndrome for decreased aggression in the population. And so the idea is that they're developing language, conscience, etc., the other 9 psychological traits that we were talking about. And the natural selection and evolution was, there's very decreased predator-prey reproductive selection. It's explains all other animal natural selection. And there's the egalitarianism for behaviors is developing. And then to rate these at 135,000 years ago, we would say, using this scale of very low, low, moderate, very high, and very high. Moderate is in the middle, and we say by 135,000 years ago, there are moderate abilities in each of these areas. And it was really the last 135,000 years to the end of the last ice age where you get this extreme decrease, extreme change in psychological abilities after the increased development of language and much stronger coalitional aggression going on. So this is a summary of our analysis of our history, our ancestor history on development of psychological abilities. It follows the pattern that we've just been describing, where, again, it's the planned aggression that's kind of driving everything else. And planned aggression is another word for egalitarianism and for behaviors. And so it's just the pattern that we've been describing here. But I think it's a very important approach for arguing and giving support for the egalitarianism hypothesis for the origin of our psychology. Okay. And here's the next to the last slide. How are we doing for time? Oh. Well, that's good. I'll finish up here in a few minutes and we'll have a lot of discussion on this. So this is further support for the egalitarianism. And of course, I could have 1 or 2 slides on each of these, but we don't have time for those today. I'm just going to mention them and say that they're really perspectives that are giving support to the importance of egalitarianism. And the first one here is the domestication syndrome that we've been talking about, that our low level of anger aggression is an example of a self-domestication syndrome, with the idea that the egalitarianism in the mobile hunter-gatherer bands was really selecting for decreased anger aggression, which is the defining point of domestication syndrome. And you're familiar with domestication syndrome. All our pet cats and dogs are a direct result of domestication syndrome. Our cattle, our farm animals are very docile because of the domestication syndrome. So this provides important supporting evidence. The migrations out of Africa at 60 to 50,000 years ago, it's the idea that really all people in this room and in the world have essentially the same language and other psychological abilities, because we're all related to the people that migrated out of Africa 50 or 60,000 years ago. And they had those abilities then, and we have them now. The high natural selection pressure, I introduced that one before, but just to mention it again. I mean, it looks like this egalitarianism is producing natural selection pressures 500 to 1,000 times greater than ever occurred in any other mammal. And that's what we're going to be arguing in the book. Identical twin studies. So far we've kind of been talking about the genetic perspective, but you know from identical twin studies, those twins that were raised together versus those that were raised apart is the only way in science that you can separate psychological abilities based on genetic background and development the family that they lived in, their environment. And, the genetic twins that are raised in the same family, when they do the psychological tests, they get very high similarity in results. But, and those similarities decrease somewhat in the identical twins that are raised separately. And the conclusions of all the identical twin studies is half of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors come from our genetics, and half comes from our upbringing, our development. So this seems like it might be a problem for this egalitarianism perspective, because really we've only been talking about the genetics here. But it's really argued that the 50% that comes from the environment is also being selected for in egalitarianism, with the idea that so the individuals that are growing up, they have to learn the cultural norms, or they will be at high risk of mortal and reproductive dangers. And it's only by learning the culture and learning and their cultural development that they can survive in the mobile hunter-gatherer band. So that so it's the idea that the egalitarianism also had strong natural selection for environmental development, family development. And we were talking a little bit about personal experience, moral agency, and free will. Again, these attributes, these psychological abilities are needed in the hunter-gatherer band to avoid the moral and reproductive risks, such that the corollary that goes along with all of this, that all of our thoughts, behaviors, and emotions, as you're sitting here living your life, are really a direct result of the the social natural selection that was occurring in the mobile hunter-gatherer band. And the last slide, summary, again, to state the thesis, in mobile hunter-gatherer bands, before the end of the last ice age, egalitarian consisting of the four behaviors produced a natural selection for our psychology. And, we think this is so important that it really should be added to, the most important perspective in biology today is called the modern synthesis. Modern synthesis consists of, Darwin's evolution through natural selection, populations or differential survival and reproduction for the development of traits and new species. And this is fitness for the environment, adaptations in new species. Then the modern synthesis added genetics perspectives on this and really found this new type of selection called kin selection and social biology. And in particular, you're familiar with that, with the insects. The ants, it's just amazing, their altruistic behavior. The army ants just go out, they never reproduce, they just go and work for the colony all the time. They never do anything for themselves. And this extreme altruism that occurred in the ants is explained by kin selection, which is closely related relatives are also selected for in the process. So we want to suggest that the modern synthesis should be updated to really that our psychological evolution occurred through natural selection by egalitarianism for behaviors in the mobile hunter-gatherer and before the end of the last ice age, just what we've been arguing. It's such an important thing. And it's really been the big limitation in Darwinian thinking that it has, in the past, it had such little application for us. We don't really feel like our, what we're living day to day, it really has much to do with the Darwinian natural selection. But I think if we add this, update the modern synthesis to this perspective, it'll have much wider application and be much more useful. And thank you very much. I think we got plenty of time for questions. Yeah, 10 minutes. Yes.
And I noticed you mentioned the word war.
War.
I'm just wondering, when one hunter-gatherer band meets another, what was the typical result? Was it conflict, or or cultural exchange, or shared resources? And if they did go to war, what was the motivation?
Right. So I should have mentioned more about that, war and hunter-gatherer. And the reason that they don't think that there's natural selection or psychological traits associated with warfare. So in particular,